On a hot summer afternoon in New York City, Donald Trump was going to the Trump Tower after concluding a senatorial meeting at the White House. The scorching sun was doubtlessly at its peak. It burned with an intensity that almost seemed to have a personal grievance. Everyone got a fair share of the heat. Well, everyone exposed to the elements was without anything to shield them. The United States president was undoubtedly shielded from the heat inside the Cadillac One motorcade, enjoying the cooling air from the Cadillac air conditioning system. President Donald Trump was the only thing Keturah, the little homeless girl, could say when the U.S. president suddenly stopped his Cadillac One in front of her and stepped down. The little girl never knew that Trump's next actions would change her life for good. Life's not fair, many would say, but a variety of equalizing options exist. Nonetheless, many still find themselves at a gross disadvantage. The reason for this? Well, there's not a definite answer. Fitting responses to this question are usually relational, as most would say. Others would summarize it all in one word: fate. While some may hold fate responsible for the unfavorable occurrences surrounding their lives, the reverse is the case for others. That fateful afternoon, while Donald Trump made his plans in the comfort of his Cadillac One motorcade, fate had other plans. Nature showed no favoritism for persons. Thus, even the little homeless girl by the roadside was under the severe heat of the sun. At that instant, when it felt like the sun couldn't get any hotter, anyone unshielded from its burning fury would make a needful escape. Everyone except Keturah. The little homeless girl sat by the pedestrian walk of an expressway, downtown in New York. She held a placard that read, "Please help, I'm homeless," and a coin jar sat in front of her. A few passers-by dropped some money, but no one had offered to help beyond that yet. She remained unwavering, occasionally using her placard to shield herself from the sun. Anyone who saw the little homeless girl must have wondered how she ended up on the street. She looked out of place sitting there. Unlike the usual appearance of roadside beggars, Keturah appeared moderately healthy, and her dress was not tattered. Her coin jar also looked somewhat cute, and she wore a sling bag with something princess-like on it. Unlike the usual disheveled appearance, she looked kempt. What responsible parents would let their child on the street like that? Keturah was such an adorable child, however. The events surrounding her life were far from pleasant. 5-year-old Keturah Adams had been appearing on the roadside daily for the last 2 weeks. She rarely spoke to anyone on the street, except for occasional thanks when someone dropped money in her jar. Whenever she left the roadside, she would head to the food eatery close by and be there for 45 minutes before heading out again. This had been her routine for the last 2 weeks. That particular day was the first day of her 3rd week by the roadside. Was she really homeless? Where did she go every night and return the next day? Keturah diligently went to her usual spot on that serene Friday and sat. For her, it was just another day. As young as she was, she didn't know much about life, but knew enough to remain optimistic. Despite the outcome of her life, which she was unhappy about, she never lost hope. Sometimes, the weight of her sadness was visible on her face. Other times, she looked cheerful. Between looking sad and cheerful, she wore a deep scowl of thoughtfulness, too deep for someone her age. Sitting at the back seat of his car, U.S. President Donald Trump stared intently at the contents of a file he held, an unreadable expression on his face as he thought deeply. Meanwhile, at the car's front seat, the intelligence officer got intel that the expressway leading directly to the Trump Tower had seen a ghastly accident. He relayed the news to the president for his directive on further actions. After a few seconds, Trump instructed them to take the route downtown. JP, the intelligence officer, reminded the president that the expressway occasionally had beggars making appearances, but Trump insisted. Unknown to him, this decision was going to herald an unexpected outcome. Signals were sent to other intelligence officers within Trump's motorcade, and shortly they were on another route. Occasionally, Trump would look away from the file he was reading, and other times, he would relax on the headrest. After a long pause, he closed the file, deciding to focus on the flashing scenery through the windscreen. They approached a red traffic light, and in compliance with the traffic regulation, the motorcade paused. While staring through the window, Trump noticed a young girl sitting exposed to the heat of the scorching sun. A placard she held over her head had been offering her some shade, but now she held it in front of herself. Something about the young girl's plight tugged at his heartstrings, and he read the bold inscription on her placard. "Stop the motorcade," Trump said loudly. "Park by the roadside, where that little girl is sitting," he added. JP and the driver exchanged puzzled glances for a few seconds before chorusing, "Yes, Mr. President." JP relayed the order into his receiver immediately. Just then, the traffic lights turned green and they proceeded. They drew the attention of passers-by as they drove, and many started to point in the direction of the motorcade, while others brought out their phones. This attention even doubled as they parked by the roadside. This time, motorists paused to catch a glimpse. Keturah Adams sat at her usual spot, the cheerful expression she wore earlier, now replaced by a deep scowl as she thought about her family. She was lost in her thoughts, and hadn't noticed that the atmosphere around her had changed. President Donald Trump alighted from his Cadillac and walked toward the brown-skinned young girl who sat oblivious. The street was starting to get crowded, murmurings and questions flying around, and phones were out recording the incident. The noise from the growing crowd was getting louder as Trump approached the young girl. Some of the noise penetrated through her daze while she sat. Slowly drawing her consciousness to her present environment, she noticed the crowd and heard some approaching footsteps from her left. Turning around, she was surprised to find some well-dressed men in suits approaching her. One of them particularly stood out from the others. He looked different. "I've seen that face before," she thought to herself. Suddenly, realization dawned on her. Now on the sidewalk, President Trump smiled warmly at the little girl as he approached her. One of his bodyguards held the umbrella over him, now casting a shadow on young Keturah. "Hi there, young girl. What is your name?" Keturah sprung to her feet as she almost screamed, "President Donald Trump!" Her face held an unmistakable look of surprise as she stared with her big round eyes. Trump took note of her overall appearance, her bag, and her money when he asked his next question. Without waiting for an answer to the first question, he added, "What's an adorable, well-dressed kid like you doing on the streets?" President Trump bent slightly as he stared intently at her. She reminded him that she had not answered his first question, but had responded with another question and spoke calmly. Her energetic surprise from moments back, now replaced by hope and curiosity, she responded, "I'm Keturah Adams." She hesitated before continuing. "And as you can see, I'm a street beggar," she said with a bit of despair. Trump was taken aback by her response and her manner of speech. It wasn't hard to tell that Keturah was a smart kid, so he stared at her for a moment before asking, "Where are your parents?" A slight frown on his face. Keturah looked back at him, sadness etched on her face. "Where?" Trump asked again. "My dad's gravesite isn't far from the alley over there," she pointed, "and my mom," she stared down at her toes as she spoke. "Mummy's very sick, and she might die soon." Trump could hear the helplessness behind her words. "Could you take me to your mummy, Keturah?" She slowly raised her head, surprise written all over her face, as her eyes glazed with unshed tears. "I promise," she said, now sobbing. "Mummy hasn't done anything bad," she continued amid tears. "We're just having a really hard time since Dad passed on," she concluded in a clearer voice. Trump was surprised that she thought he was going to reprimand her mom for something. "I know I'm not supposed to be on the street," Keturah said, wiping her face. "There's not much I can do since I'm just a kid," she added. "How old are you, Keturah?" Trump asked. In response, Keturah held her hand and spread her fingers apart, saying, "I am 5 years old. I'll be 6 soon. And no, I don't have other siblings or family members." How did she know what question I was going to ask next? Trump thought to himself. "Let's go see your mummy," he said with finality as he stood straight. Keturah picked up her cute money jar in one hand and held onto her placard with the other. She took 2 steps, then she suddenly stopped and looked round. She was searching the crowd for something. President Trump noticed and paused. "Mr. Jacobs!" she screamed, waving at an old man. "Please, a moment, Mr. President," Keturah said politely to Trump as she ran toward Mr. Jacobs. Trump stared in amazement, wondering what she was up to. She stopped before the old man, handed him her placard, emptied her money jar, and put it into her princess bag. Then she handed the empty money jar to the old man. "I'll come back for them soon," she said. "God bless you, child," he responded as she turned and ran back toward the Cadillac. Upon reaching the president, she was out of breath. Just as she approached, he handed her a bottle of water. "Thank you, Mr. President," she said, almost out of breath. Who would have thought that 5-year-old Keturah, who had been begging by the road, would be getting into the presidential vehicle of the U.S. president? Fate does amazing things sometimes. However, this was not the end. Another unexpected chain of events awaited her in the coming hours, days, and months. The internet was already buzzing with news supported by photos and videos from moments back. Some expressed shock at how patient Donald Trump had seemed while handling young Keturah, even highlighting how he had given her a bottle of water. Others captured and captioned the moment when Keturah was crying, and Trump's face looked somewhat stern. indirectly insinuating that he made the little girl cry. Ignoring all the buzz from his tablet, Trump turned to Keturah. "Who is Mr. Jacobs?" He stared at her. She smiled slightly and said, "He owns an eatery very close to the roadside where I usually sit." Keturah continued, "Before I started sitting by the roadside, I had tried to." She paused, looking up at Trump innocently, before adding, "I had to get a job." She looked down and shrugged. "Nobody offered me one. They all said I was too young." When I came to Mr. Jacobs' eatery and spoke to him about everything, he also refused to give me a job. However, he agreed to give me some food every day. Seeing his kind nature, I persisted and asked if he could let me wash some cups for a little tip. I didn't want to be idle and get free food. You understand, right? She asked the president, who was stunned by the persistence and ideologies that a 5-year-old upheld. Too shocked to respond, he simply nodded yes. "Please don't sanction Mr. Jacob for allowing me to wash cups for daily tips. I told him it was just for a while, and it was really easy. I would only work for 40 minutes. When I left his eatery, I saw an old man who begged by the road, and I got the idea to do the same, so I went for it." President Trump had gotten used to the fact that young Keturah was smart. However, he was stunned every once in a while by her flawless and smart communication. He handed her a jar of chocolate and sweets, and to his surprise, she asked for a hand sanitizer. After sanitizing her hands, Keturah thanked him and started eating the chocolate. She described where she stayed with her mother, and the driver was making his way there. "What school did you attend before now?" Trump asked. Keturah gave a surprising response. "I am homeschooled. My mom taught me everything I needed to know, and I began reading books too." As they drove on following Keturah's description, the environment around them began to change. Soon enough, they stopped in front of what looked like a hut, but was made of umbrellas and waterproof materials. The environment was lonely, with only a few poorly structured houses in the distance. The door to the Cadillac was opened from the outside, and Keturah led the way, taking the president to her mother. The small crowded hut now hosted the President of the United States of America. The intelligence officers and guards took positions as necessary while the president went in. How fate has smiled on Mrs. Juliet Adams. Hearing strange footsteps, she sat up right from her bed, startled by the strangers approaching. "Keturah?" she called out. Keturah stood before her with the most unexpected guests she could have thought of. "Yes, Mummy, I brought someone to meet you," she replied, smiling. "Good evening, Mrs." Trump started. "Juliet Adams. Good evening, Mr. President, sir." She attempted to sound healthy, but failed, her voice revealing how sick and frail she was at the time. Concern etched on the face of Trump as he studied the woman who sat before him. She bore a striking resemblance to Keturah. He inquired how they got to be in that situation, and Mrs. Juliet narrated about her family ordeal. Keturah brought a small stool for Trump, which he humbly sat on. This humble expression of a president sitting before Juliet contrasted every single narrative painted about him. It was almost impossible to believe that the President Donald Trump was seated in her poor excuse of a house. "Tell me your story, Mrs. Juliet. How did you and your daughter end up this way?" Overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had happened, Keturah's mother stuttered as she tried to speak, eventually ending up in tears. Keturah joined her mother on the makeshift bed and nestled in her embrace. Mrs. Juliet took a deep breath and summoned the strength and courage to narrate her life's ordeal to the president. Keturah Adams was born to Juliet Adams and Joseph Adams in Syracuse, New York. The couple had migrated from West Africa to the United States 7 years ago to start their lives. Via their occupation as teachers, they had applied for dependent visas and had been teaching since then. Less than 2 years into their teaching career and staying in New York, they welcomed their daughter Keturah into the world. It was all joy and laughter for the next 4 years, until the 5th year launched with devastating news and misfortune. Keturah's father had taken ill and was diagnosed with glioblastoma, a brain cancer. They explored the available options, radiation therapy and chemotherapy, but all to no avail. Their last option was surgery, but they couldn't afford it at the time. They had been spending a lot of money on therapies and drugs. Their house bills were piling up, the house mortgage was due, and even the visa renewal. Everything seemed to be happening at once. Mr. Adams had to stop working because of the constant seizures and memory loss. He remained hospitalized, and the hospital bills were kept up. After a while, they managed to put together some money for surgery, but he didn't make it out of the OR alive. Overcome by debts, bills, and raising a young child, Mrs. Juliet had to work extra hours. She and her husband had planned to enroll Keturah in school once she turned 4 years old, and she was already 4 at the time of her dad's passing. However, Mrs. Juliet couldn't manage it due to the financial burden. They had taken loans for her husband's surgery, which she was trying to pay off, and the other bills were overflowing. Thus, she decided to continue homeschooling Keturah while she worked almost round the clock to make ends meet. Barely 6 months into that arrangement, she fell ill herself. Her body system couldn't cope with the stress. When the illness became severe, she conducted a full body examination, which revealed that beyond stress, she had pancreatic cancer. It didn't take long before she had to stop working and was hospitalized. Without her job or a stream of income, they lost the house. They had to sell a few things to pay off the remaining debt. With no money for hospital bills and therapy, they ended up in the shack where the president found them. Keturah's face was soaked with tears as her mom concluded the story. Even Mrs. Adams was also in tears. Almost overcome by emotions, Trump said, "I sympathize with you and your daughter, Mrs. Juliet. Please accept my condolences. You and your late husband have raised an outstanding young girl." His voice dripped with genuine sympathy. "From here on, I would take it as a personal responsibility to see that this story doesn't end here." A thought struck Trump's mind, 2 questions boggling at his curiosity, so he asked, "Please pardon my inquisition, but if I may, you know you had a terrible cancer and were at the risk of death. Did you make any arrangements for Keturah just in case?" "Yes, Mr. President. While I sought financial aid, I contacted many offices and persons to no avail. However, I also secured contact with an orphanage home. I explained everything to them and got their contact details. Keturah has them in her princess bag. I instructed her to call the matron in charge if anything happened to me. I felt so helpless and didn't know what to do." She sobbed as she concluded. "Also, I held on to Keturah's clothes and accessories while we lost the house. That's her bag over there," she said, pointing to a beautiful princess suitcase that looked out of place in the hut room. "If for any reason I couldn't be there for her, I just wanted her to appear as smart as I've taught her to speak and behave." Understanding and realization dawned on Trump. Keturah's appearance, smartness, wits, wisdom, and everything else hadn't been by coincidence. This mother had taught her daughter too well, but their life hadn't been fair. At that point, he couldn't find words to say anything, but a decision was made in his heart. It was to bring the most beauty out of the almost dying ashes of Mrs. Juliet and her daughter Keturah's lives. "You are a great mother, Mrs. Juliet. Better days are coming your way henceforth." 20 minutes after stepping into the hut, President Trump stepped out holding young Keturah by the hand. Following his instructions, Keturah's suitcase and relevant belongings were loaded into the trunk of the Cadillac, and an ambulance was arranged to transport Mrs. Juliet to the hospital, where immediate necessary care was rendered. Housing arrangements were also made, and the rest of their belongings, which Mrs. Juliet wanted to keep, were moved into the new house. The news of Mrs. Juliet and her daughter Keturah's story spread like wildfire, thus completing the puzzle that began with Trump and the young roadside beggar. However, it didn't end there. Fate crowned this story with more jewels than any could have imagined. The president had been studying some regulations surrounding the immigration policy on that fateful afternoon when he encountered young Keturah. There was an ongoing contemplation about making certain adjustments. The story of Keturah's family highlighted the plight of many immigrant families and specific needs that policy adjustment had to cater for. With that, adjustments were made to the policies surrounding the lives of immigrants concerning healthcare access, work security, residency, and citizenship acquirement. Over the following weeks, Keturah's life began to transform. Her mother had successfully undergone surgery and was recuperating. She stayed at the Trump Tower until her mother was fully recovered and discharged from the hospital. They had gotten their citizenship, their visas were sorted out, and they had acquired permanent residency. It seemed as though life couldn't get any better, but it did. She could not help but be grateful to President Donald Trump. Her life's journey continued, a testament to the impact that kindness and compassion could make in anyone's life. What are your thoughts on Keturah's story and the intervention of Donald Trump? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this video was inspiring, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, turn on the notification bell to receive notifications about new posts. Before you go, watch the other videos displayed on your screen. See you next time.